In this course, we're going to learn the React fundamentals in just 1 hour. We'll start out by learning what is React and why so many people use it. We'll then learn the key concepts. After that, we'll learn some new features that are often used in React from JavaScript. Then we'll do a demo application. It'll be a to-do app, and I know that sounds cliche or kind of lame, but trust me, it is definitely the best way to understand the fundamentals. And then we'll kind of explain what you should learn next and how to further your knowledge. In this section, we're going to give a brief overview of what is React and why we use it. So React is a client-side or front-end framework developed by Facebook. It is only concerned with the presentation layer, so what the viewer actually is seeing. It's based in JavaScript, or you can use TypeScript, and it helps you develop fast, modern, and manageable projects through a component-based architecture. There's a concept of a virtual DOM, which you don't have to worry too much about. It's a little bit confusing, but basically you tell React what you want it to render, and it finds the most efficient, fastest ways to render that on the client's browser. So here's React's website. You can see here the component-based architecture is a big factor of it. A declarative approach where you tell React, hey, this is what I want you to render. And like I said, it renders it in the fastest way. And then you can learn once and write everywhere. So it's really nice because there's something called React Native as well, which allows you to develop mobile apps using a very similar programming style as the React applications. In this section, we're going to explain why so many companies choose to React. In this section, we're going to explain why so many companies choose to use React and why you should too. React is really easy to understand and maintain. It's very performant. There's a huge ecosystem of people who are building components and plugins and libraries that help your React application function. So for example, this is a calendar component provided by Airbnb that you can use for free to simply add a calendar component to your application. Or there's components for adding Google Maps very easily, adding form controls, anything of that nature. And trust me when I say that ecosystem is huge. Also, if you have almost any issue, there's probably going to be a Stack Overflow thread for it with an answer of how to resolve your issue. And it's used by very many major companies like Facebook, Airbnb, ESPN, etc. In this section, we're going to cover the key concepts in React. So React revolves around this idea of components. It's breaking up your code into individual parts of the website. So if we look here, we have GitHub's website. So components could be breaking the nav bar up into one separate component, breaking that landing view you see into a component, as well as breaking that registration form down. You could also create components for the button, for these inputs, for these drop downs here, for the search bar. It's kind of an art more so than a science. Here's another example. You could break down this nav bar. You could break down this into a search bar component. You could break this into a company images component. And then you could also break this down into a trending topics component with cards, buttons could be components. These labels could be components. These images can be components. Once again, it's more of an art than a science. So some key components or some key concepts with components are this idea of JSX. So JSX is JavaScript and HTML. It allows you to do things like this. So here we have some normal HTML that I'm sure you're familiar with. But for this sign in button here, of course, if the user is already logged in, we don't want to show a sign in button. So instead, we'd want to show log out. So this red chunk here is an example of JSX. You can see it's surrounded by HTML, but right in the middle of our HTML, we have these braces that open up a block of JavaScript saying, hey, if the current user is null, we want to show a sign in button. But if there actually is a current user, we all want to show log out. We don't want to show sign in. In this section, we'll cover two more key concepts in React, namely state and props. So state is, well, the state of a component or of the application. And props are just short for properties that are passed down from parent to children components. So you might be asking yourself, what is state? Where would I use it? So here are 2 or 3 good examples. So say you have a login form and you want to keep track of the user's email and password, as well as whether or not they've checked the Remember Me checkbox. So you might have a string for email and a string for password, and then a Boolean to know whether or not the user has currently checked the Remember Me checkbox. Another example is a video player you're watching right now. So the video player is going to want to keep track of whether or not you paused it, how far you've already made it in the video, as well as say maybe the volume, if it's full screen, or what the title of it is. One more example, which will be the application we're building, is a to-do list. So in a to-do list, you're going to keep track of the title of the list. You're going to keep track of each individual to-do item and whether or not that item is completed. So here on the right, we have an example of the code that goes along with keeping track of state. So here you see state is just a JavaScript object, and then you can define it however you'd like. So here we have a string that keeps track of the list title, and then we have an array of the to-dos. The to-dos are objects with a title and a completed Boolean. So here, this is a class-based component. In React, we'll explain more of that. And then you can see here we have the header. We have that label title here, as well as here we have some JSX again. JavaScript, this is this.state.todos.map. So what this is going to do is look at this.state.todos, which is right here, and it's going to loop through each one. That's what the .map means. It's an ES6 function. And it's going to take each individual to-do, and it's going to render out a component that we create, which is called to-do list item, which is just going to represent one individual item. From there, we can pass the to-do.title, which will be this title here, here, and here, as well as whether or not it's completed. And these 2 lines here are what are called passing props. And so your props or property would be title and completed. We can take a look at that here. So we have a component with props. Remember in the last slide, we had title equals to-do.title and complete equals to-do.completed. As you can see here, it's just laid out in one line. Now we can take these props and say conditionally render things. So say we want to know whether or not this.props completed is true. If it's true, we're going to go ahead and show a check mark. If it's not true, we're just going to show a checkbox allowing the user to check it off. We can use it down here for this.props.title. So in our to-do list item component, we can render the title from the props given. In this section, we're going to cover the final key concept in React, as well as explain how to get started. So one more concept in React is lifecycle methods, which allow you to control the rendering and updating of components. Now, we're not going to explain it right now because it's a lot easier. I promise you, it's much easier to understand in practice than it is conceptually. So let's talk about getting started. To get started in React, you're going to need something called Node.js. Now, what is Node.js? If we open a new window, go to type in Node.js on Google. Node.js is simply a runtime built on a JavaScript engine. So it allows you, it's like Java Virtual Machine or something of that sort, and it allows you to run JavaScript applications in an environment. Now, along with Node.js comes this very useful tool called NPM. And NPM is Node Package Manager. So that's what allows you to install those things like the React Calendar by Airbnb, as well as a command line interface we're going to install called Create React App. So Create React App is a command line tool to generate a basic React project. It's going to give you all the files and tooling you need to not only develop your application in development, but it's also going to include a Webpack bundler that's going to take your application and convert them into production assets that are ready to serve off to the internet. This is I said a lot of confusing words there, but trust me, you'll understand it by the end of this course. And the ease of use with Create React App is unprecedented. Trust me, if you try and set up a React application on your own, it's going to be so confusing. You're going to be lost trying to understand all these different components that tie together. So using the Create React App command line interface is by far the easiest way to get started. In this section, we're going to get hands-on and actually install everything we need to get started with React. So to start out with, we're going to want to install Node. To do that, we'll just go to nodejs.org. We'll scroll down, we'll see here the version recommended for most users. Right now it's 10.16. If it's not this exact version, I would still recommend to go with this version here and not the latest version. So you go ahead and you'll click that. It'll install a little package, and you'll want to go ahead and go through the steps in this prompt. I already have Node.js installed, so I'm not going to go through these steps. But if you have any issues, I would encourage you to just look on Google. There's probably going to be a quick answer or a comment, or make a comment in the comments, and I'll try and help out. After you get Node installed and you go through those steps, you're going to want to go ahead and run this command here. Node gives you this npm command, this Node Package Manager command, and it's going to allow you to install this new command line interface called Create React App. And this -g flag just means global, so it's going to install it globally on your computer. Now we'll go ahead, we'll type the command in, npm install create react app -g, and it has to be this exact typing. And you might be wondering where that's coming from. If you just Google create react app, it'll take you to this page here. So this is a repository that you're installing by running npm install. So we'll go ahead and we'll run that. It'll take a few seconds to actually run all those packages. If you get this permission denied error, that means you need to run it as a super user. So we'll run sudo npm install and just the same exact command, create react app -g. It'll prompt you to enter your password, and then it will go ahead and it'll actually install it. I already have it installed, but it just reinstalled there for me. So after that's complete, now we can actually use our create react app tool. So we're going to want to cd into any directory that we want our code to lie in. I'm already in the directory I want. So I'm going to run create react app, and then you give the app a name. So I'm just going to call it udemy-demo. Now this is going to go ahead and run. It's going to install React, React DOM, and React scripts, as well as many other packages. So React is the framework. React DOM handles the virtual DOM, as well as React script runs those actual start, deploy, and build application, or those commands. We'll come back in the next section and we'll explain more of what these individual commands do and where they're kind of coming from. In this section, we're going to cover how you actually get your React application running and what all these commands mean, as well as where they come from. So to get started, I love using Visual Studio Code. There's no promotion here. It's just free and lightweight and really easy to use editor that comes with a lot of extensions that help out. And I encourage you to download it if you don't already have a code editor of choice. Just Google Visual Studio Code, go to their website, and you'll see it's free to download. You can also use Atom or Sublime or whatever your text editor of choice is. So I'm going to go ahead, open code, and then from there, I'm going to go ahead and find my package, and I'm going to open it. So now here, I can see the layout of a React project. So we have a node modules folder, a public folder, a source folder, as well as these files here. Now, if you're wondering where these commands come from, well, they're defined in this file here called package.json. Package.json is not specific to React, it's specific to NPM. So you can see here we have our project name. We can have these dependencies, which are React. Remember we saw those earlier, React, React DOM, and React scripts, as well as the scripts you see over here. Start, build, test, and eject. Start, build, test, and eject. So if we run npm run start, oops, I need a CD. You need a CD into your project folder first. So CD Udemy demo. Now we run npm run start. We'll see it looks like it's running a command, and it's starting this development server. Let me minimize these other tabs for you. So now you can see we have a running application. It says compiled successfully. It's running at this address. If it didn't automatically boot up in your browser, you can just go to that address there. And you can see a running React app. Everything works, no issues. So this yarn start command is starting up this development environment of our React application. If we run npm run build, that's going to go ahead and build static production assets for our application. So the difference between start and build is start is running a server that's dynamically ready to change. If you make a change in your code, so say we go to this website or to this file here, and instead of edit, we say, hey, it'll change automatically. But we don't want to use this in production. We want to deliver static assets. So we would just run npm run build, and it's going to create a build folder that's going to house static assets. Now, you might be wondering, what are all these other files and folders doing here? Okay, let's go through some of them. These files here are app.js is usually what people use as the main sort of component for their application, kind of a wrapper component. And then index.js is the entry point to your application, just kind of like index.html, but for React to know, hey, this is what I need to render, and then it'll actually render this app based on this component here. This public folder houses an HTML file that has kind of some basic information. If you don't have JavaScript in your environment, it'll show you an error message. And then node modules are all these packages that are installed by NPM and their dependencies of, say, React. So this is really nice because look at all this code you're avoiding having to run by using React. Now in the next section, we're going to delete the files right here, and then we're going to start from scratch and we're going to build a demo application. In this section, I'm going to quickly brush up on a few new features in JavaScript that might be unfamiliar if you came from a previous version. So here in the first bullet, we can see, you might remember variables are declared like this, var name equals Austin. But in the new JavaScript ES6 syntax, we now have two new keywords, let and const. So let refers to a variable that may change its context. So say point scored or something of that nature. Const refers to a variable that will never change in the runtime. So say something maybe like a primary color or something of that nature. And then another feature is class-based components. So now in ES6 JavaScript, you can write files as classes instead of just const with a return. And then one thing to notice is the this keyword, if you're familiar with it. Well, if not, don't worry, we'll go over it later. But it depends on how it's called in the class, unlike many other languages. And one other new feature that you might see a lot of is arrow functions. So arrow functions are taking the previous way of writing a function like this, where you just have add with parameters and two different numbers, and you return a plus b. And an arrow function, you can define that in this sort of manner, and it does the same exact thing. In this section, we're going to actually get started building our React application. Like I said, we're going to start out by deleting all these files so you don't wonder where they're all coming from. When you're building a React application, you're going to spend the majority of your time working with this source directory. Let's go ahead and delete and move these files to the trash. Next, we're going to want to build every React project basically starts with two files, an index.js as well as an app.js. Index needs to be named index.js, but app.js can have any name you choose. We'll explain more why in a minute. Next, we're going to start by importing some classes. So what this is going to do is going to pull these packages in so you can use their functionality. So we're going to import React and import React DOM. And React is going to come from React, and React DOM is going to come from React/DOM. Now, to render a React application, we got to start by doing React DOM.render, and we're going to want to render an element. So let's just start out by saying div, hey, we're working with React. And this function is going to take one more parameter. It's going to take one called document, or it's going to take the root node of your application, which is going to be defined in your index.html. So you can see this ID right here is root. So we're going to run document.getElementById root. Now if we save this, I'm just going to fancy it up a little bit so it's easier to read. And then we run yarn start. It'll take just a second. It's going to start our development server, and it's going to show, hey, we're working with React. If we change that, we're working with React, we have our S there as well. Now, the common way to do this is to abstract this out into a top level app component. So we delete this, and then we'd render a component. And to render a component, we just give the name of the component, and then we'll have to import it. So we'll import app from app. And now, oops, I'm going to clean this up just a little bit more. Now if we go under app.js, this is where we'll actually learn to create a component. We'll come back in the next section and create our first component. In this section, we're going to create our first React component. So let's get started. You'll start out again by importing React. In any file that you use JSX, you're going to have to import React. From there, we're going to go ahead and create a class. To do that, we'll define the class keyword. We'll give it a name, call it app, and we're going to extend react.component. Now this is going to give this class all the features of React and let React control how it renders. To actually render something in a class component, we'll want to create the render function. By extending react.component, this render function is sent to React, and then it knows what to render. We'll then want to return what we want to be rendered. So we can say we created our first component. And from there, you're going to want to export that class. So export default app. Now if we save, we see, hey, we created our first component. That's awesome, right? Now we'll come back in the next section and we'll get started building a to-do app. Before we get started building our application, I'm going to show you one other way that you can define components in React. So the first example we did was with the class-based component. That's a new feature as of ES6, but we can also define components in a different way. To do this, we'll define it as a const. So we'll say const app, and we'll create an arrow function like we described earlier, and then we'll just return an element as we did before. So we'll say div, we created another React component. And then if we save that, we can see it updated and it rendered just in the same manner. The only difference in defining it this way is you can't provide state in a component defined in this manner. In a class-based component, as we had earlier, you can add state to the class. But when you define your components as a const, unless you use a new feature called React Hooks, which we won't go over in this course, as it's a lot more confusing, you won't be able to use state. We'll come back in the next section and we'll get started. Section, we're going to get started creating our to-do list component. So to do that, we'll go into our source folder and we'll click create a new file. We'll call that to-do-list.js. Now in here, we're going to do the same thing as we did before. We're going to start by importing React from React, and then we're going to create a class-based component because we'll need state here. So we'll say class to-do-list extends react.component, and we're going to create a render function. One quick note is instead of exporting the file at the bottom, you can also just export default here. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to return. Let's just go ahead and return some text so we know that the component is rendering properly. We'll say to-do list. Now, to actually render this component, we're going to have to go into our app file and create a component here. Say to-do list. Now we can go ahead and import it up at the top. Import to-do list from /to-do list. Now if we save this, we go ahead and look, we have our to-do list rendering. Now we can do the same thing to render a to-do list item, say to-do list item.js, and then we'll import React again from React. And then let's just define this one as a const. Let's say const to-do list item equals, and we're going to return a div saying to-do list item. Now if we go back to our to-do list, in a typical to-do list, you're going to have multiple to-do list items, right? So we're just going to render that, maybe say 3 times. And then we'll have to go ahead, come up to the top, and import that from to-do list item. Now if we go ahead and save that, oh, we have a little bit of an error. We forgot to export it. If you ever see this error, that just means you forgot to export it. So we can say export default to-do list item. Now you can see here, we have 3 to-do list items. We'll come back in the next section. We'll style it up a little bit, and then we'll start to add some functionality. In this section, I'm going to show you a few of the common ways to incorporate styling into your React application. Now recall, we're just rendering regular HTML elements, so we're still using CSS to define our styles. One of the most common ways is just using regular CSS classes. So you can do that just as you would with the normal HTML application. You can also use inline styles, but those are generally recommended to avoid. And then you can also use what's called CSS in JS, which is usually provided by third-party libraries, such as styled components, which is one we'll go over, as well as CSS modules. But I really recommend styled components if you want to use one of those, because it's definitely really good. Now let's take a look at how you'd use regular CSS classes. So you just define the class name as you normally would. So we could say maybe to-do list, and then you'll go ahead and you'll create a CSS file just like you normally would. So if we go new file, say styles.css, now we can go ahead and create a class to do, what did we call it? To-do dash list. And then we could add, say, a background color of red. And we'll define them just like we would a regular CSS file, so we don't need those quotes. And then now, if we go to our application, it's not going to show, but we'll have to import that file. And notice the import syntax is going to be slightly different. So we're going to import without a named import here. We're just going to import styles.css. Now if we go ahead and save that, we should see a red background. In this section, we're going to do a little bit of cleanup, install our component just a little bit more, but we don't want to focus too much on that, as that's not really a core component of React. But let's go ahead, let's get rid of this red background, as that doesn't look that great. And let's just go ahead and add a text align center that will center all of our content. Oops, text dash align. Now we can see our content centered in our to-do list. Let's go to our app and let's get rid of this. We created our first component. We can delete that, and we can also delete these surrounding divs. Now if we go to our to-do list, we can't see it that well, but let's add a H2. So let's make this to-do list item a header. Let's go ahead and add a label saying title. We want to be able to display the title. Let's add an input and placeholder, enter title, as well as let me capitalize this, and let's also add a type of text. Now if we save that, we'll see our updated title and text. Let's add a little break here so we can kind of see that a little better. And then down below our to-do list items, let's add a button, or let's add another input with a placeholder of to-do item name and type of text as well. And then let's add a button to add that item to our list. So add item to list. Let's take a look at that. And that looks good enough. It doesn't look great, but we want to focus more on the core concepts of React. So we'll come back in the next section, or actually let's first delete these to-do list items as well. And then we'll come back in the next section and we'll take a look at using some JSX to actually render our to-do list items. Let me add one more break here so that doesn't line up like that. Okay, we'll come back in the next section. In this section, we're going to go ahead and add some state to our application. Let's get started. To add state to our application, we're either going to define it in this way as state as an object like this, or if we want to, we can also define it with a constructor. And inside the constructor, we'll have to call this.state. And then we can define it here. The easier syntax, I think, is just to use state as an object like this, unless you need to use a constructor. And we'll go ahead and we'll add a list title. And then we'll add to-do items. Let's start hard coding a couple in there just so we can get something to render. Let's give it a title of go jogging and completed as false. And then let's add a title of run on the beach and completed, maybe say true. Let's give our list title an actual title. Hey, I'm the title. Oh, we have these single quotes. We need double quotes. Hey, I'm the title if we're going to use a single quote inside. And now if we want these state values to actually show in our application, we can go down here and say in our title slot, we can remove this Actually, let's not remove that. Let's just put it in as our value of our input and say this.state.list title. And now if we have a title defined, it'll actually show, hey, I'm the title. If this string is empty, there'll just be a placeholder for the user to actually enter the title. Now to render our to-do list item components, we're going to want to go ahead and use some JSX. This is where JSX comes handy. So now if we go this.state.todos, that's going to refer to state.todos. Now we can use what's called the map function. And what we're going to do is we're going to take one argument that's going to be each individual to-do, and we're going to return something. So what this is going to do is it's going to take this little to-do, it's going to do whatever happens. Then it's going to move on to the next one and do whatever we define here. And it's going to loop through all of them, just like a for loop you'd see in other languages. So now we're going to go ahead and we'll return. Let's just start out returning a div that says to-do.title and to-do.completed, just to make sure everything's working right. So now if we go to our application, we can see go jogging, and we'll probably want to make this to a string as it's not showing. So now go jogging and false, which is what we defined up here, go jogging, false, and run on the beach and true, run on the beach and true. So now we can get rid of this block here, and we can, for each to-do item, we're going to want to return a to-do list item component. So now if we save that, we see we have our to-do list item, to-do list item. Now if we go to this component, we probably don't want it to just say to-do list item. We want it to render what's actually in this information here. So we do that through something called props. We'll come back in the next section and we'll add some props or properties that we can pass down to each to-do list item component. In this section, we're going to start working with props or properties. They're pretty easy to implement, and we'll get started with our to-do list item, which is going to need to know the title and whether or not the individual to-do is completed. So how will it know that? Well, through passing props. So we can give a prop any name we want except for taken names, so like class name or things of that nature. So we could call it to-do underscore title, or we could call it to just title, which is what I'll do. And then where is that title coming from? Well, it's coming from each to-do dot title. Now we can add one for completed as well, because we want to know whether or not the individual to-do has been finished. So where's that coming from? The same spot, to-do dot completed. Now if we go ahead and we go to our to-do list item component, we can just do a quick console.log of props. Well, where are props coming from exactly? Well, in an arrow function, we'll just go ahead and add it as a parameter to our arrow function. And then we can see here our props, which are exactly what's defined in our to-do list.js in state. And that's what we passed, remember, because it came from this.state.todos.map. So we have these two little errors here. Don't worry too much about those. We'll fix those in just a second. But now we have props being passed. Well, what do we want to do with that? We want to go ahead and render the titles and not render this to-do list item. So how do we do that? We're going to go ahead and just create a span. Oops, if I can type right. And we'll do props dot the name of the actual prop that was defined back here. Which, what did we name it? We just named it title. So we'll do props.title. Now if we save that, we can see, hey, that's awesome. They're actually being passed. So now let's go ahead and let's delete this console.log. And let's add an input that's a checkbox, depending on whether or not the user has finished the to-do. So we'll input type/checkbox and save that. And now you can see, even though back here where we defined our run on the beach as completed, it's unchecked. So to fix that, we'll just add a checked property that comes with the HTML elements. And how do we know whether or not it's checked? Well, we'll just check props.completed. And if the item is completed, hey, it's already checked. That's awesome. And now we'll add one more element here called just a button that will be delete to do. Now we can, if we click this at the end of the day, we want it to get rid of this to do off of our to-do list. So now we'll take a break. We'll come back in the next section and we'll get rid of our predefined state, and we'll start working with actual user state. In this section, we're going to get rid of our predefined state and allow users to actually create to-do items and add them to the state. So let's start by deleting these two to-dos here, and let's make our title an empty string. Now if we go ahead and we save this, we can tell everything's gone, and now it's ready for us to enter a title. Now if we go down to our title input, we see we already have the value tied to the state, so whenever the state changes, so if we type in this, it's going to show up, but we don't have a way to handle the actual changing if we type in letters. So to do that, we need to add what's called an onChange event handler. So I'm going to format this just a little bit so it's easier to tell what's going on. And then we'll add our onChange event handler. Now in HTML, it's usually all lowercase, but in JSX, it's going to be kind of this camel case. And then onChange, we're going to want to define an arrow function so that it's not called automatically. If you don't define an arrow function here and you just define some logic, it's going to call as soon as a page is rendered, which is not what we want. And so onChange, we're going to need one parameter called an event. And what we're going to do is we're going to run this.setState. And what are we going to set? We want to set our list title to, what is it? It's going to be the event.target.value. Now that's just going to get whatever the user inputs into that actual input item, and it's going to set the state. Now notice we don't do anything. We don't write this like this.state.listTitle equals event.target.value. This is called a mutation of the state, which is 100% against the principles of React. And first of all, you're not allowed to do it, and it's just against the way that that React is built to work. So instead of setting the state directly, we run a function called this.setState and let React take care of actually changing the state. Now if we go ahead and we save this, we go in and we start typing, now we'll see that it's actually updated. And there's something called React DevTools, which is a Chrome extension that allows you to easily see kind of what's going on with your app, and I encourage you to download it. So now in our React DevTools, if we look here at our to-do list component, we can see we have our state here, no to-dos, but a list title. And if we remove this, see how it turned yellow and updated? Or we see here, type test, and it shows here. So now we know that our state's working for our to-do items, but we haven't added any logic to add items to our to-do list. So I'll come back in the next section and we'll add some logic to actually add items to our to-do list. In this section, we're going to explore the concept of lifting up state. Now you might have wondered, why are we keeping the title and the completed information in the state of the to-do list as an array and not in the individual to-do item? Well, the reason for this is because if we want to add an item to our to-do list or remove one, we wouldn't be able to render them here in this fashion if we had the information stored in the to-do list items, and it just simply wouldn't work out. So what we're doing here is kind of this idea of lifting up state. So what we're doing, instead of keeping the state in the individual to-do list item, we're quote unquote lifting it up to the state of the to-do list. Now this is going to allow us to control all of our to-do items from our to-do list component. We'll come back in the next section and we'll continue. In this section, we're going to focus on adding the functionality so that when we create a to-do item, so say go to store and click add item to list, it'll actually add this item to our state. Now to get started doing that, first we need to keep track of what the user types. So to do that, we're going to go to our input. I'm just going to make this look a little bit nicer so it's easier to read. And then we're going to need to add two props. So one is the value and one is onChange. Now we need to keep track of this, so we need to add it to our state. So we could call it, say, current value. And now that'll keep track of what is the user currently typed in this input and not necessarily the title input. So now we can go down here and we can call the value this.state.currentValue. So now whatever we type in here, oops, let's comment this out for now. Notice comments are double slashes. We can save that. And now if we type in a value here, it's going to update in our to-do item here. Let's get rid of that really quick. And now we need to add our onChange event handler. So if we go to our React DevTools real quick, and we go to our to-do list, and we go down to this input here, we can see there's no state. But if we go ahead and we call this dot set, whoops, we're going to want to use an arrow function, remember. So we're going to call, whoops, this dot set state. And what are we going to want to set? Well, we're going to want to set the current value. What do we want to set it to? Just like before, how we had the event parameter. It's going to be the same idea. We're going to add an event parameter here. And the same thing, we're going to do event.target.value. And that's going to pull the value off. So now, if we type something in here, if we go to our React DevTools, we can go ahead, we can go here, and we can see, hey, the value is already calculated right here. And that's awesome. So now, or if we go to our to-do list item, we can see it's in the state right here. So now we want to be able to have the button actually add that value to the list, to the state. So we'll come back in the next section and we'll implement that functionality. We're going to add functionality to get our button actually working. So in the last section, recall, we updated our input to keep track of the current state. And now when we click the add item to list, we want it to actually add that item to our state. So how are we going to do that? We're going to add an onClick handler. So instead of onChange, it's onClick. And now we're going to use an arrow function once again, but this time we're going to set state to, we're going to call, what do we want to set? We want to set our to-dos to have this new item. Now, if we just set it like this and we say to-dos is equal to an array with a title of this.state.current value and completed as false, let's take a look at what this does. We can go ahead and say test1, add item to list. Okay, that looks good. That doesn't look like too big of an issue. If we go to our state on our to-do list, looks promising. Now if we add a test2, oh, what just happened? We lost our test1. Well, that's because we're setting our state to just this. Now instead of doing that, we want to concatenate that, and we want to take whatever our previous state was, which was the test1, and add the test2 to that. So how do we do that? Well, we add a parameter to our set state function called previous state. So now instead of setting to-dos like that, we're going to take our previous state, the to-dos that were on that state, and we're going to concatenate or add our new value to that state. So now let's give it a try and see what this does. So now we're going to go ahead, test1. Oops, we made a small little mistake. We need to return this. So we need to wrap these brackets in parentheses. Whoops, let's see here. We need to wrap this bracket all the way to this bracket in parentheses. Let me divide this up so you guys can read it a little better. I'm gonna go ahead, set state. What do we want to set? We want to set that guy. And then let's clean this up a little bit. This looks a little bit confusing, but it's just syntax. Don't get confused. And now if we run it, test1, test2, test3, we have no issues. One problem that's kind of weird is that this here is still saying the last to-do added. And to fix that, you can just add another line to your set state call. So this is setting the to-dos. Now we can go ahead and add another line that's going to reset our list title. So we just want to change list title back to an empty string. Now if we go ahead and add test1, go ahead and add test2. Oops, that's not looking right. Oops, we don't want to use list title, we want to use current value. So let's try that again, test1, test2, and see how it's resetting that name there. That's really convenient. Now the user can tell, hey, that's already been added. They can add a new one and no issue. That's awesome. So in the next section, we'll come back and we'll implement the actual deleting of to-dos functionality. In this section, we're going to focus on implementing the functionality of this delete to-do button. Now, one small thing we're going to have to think about is that our state containing the information about each individual to-do is stored in an array in the state of the to-do list component. But the button that actually deletes the to-do is going to be located in the to-do list item component. So what we're going to need to do here is create an onClick handler that is going to take props, and that prop is going to be a function we create here in the to-do list component that actually modifies this component's state. Sounds a little confusing, but you'll understand by the end of this video. So let's create a function here called delete to do by index. So we could delete to do by the name of the to do, but the issue then becomes if we have multiple to dos with the same name, then once we click delete to do, it's going to delete both of them. So instead, we're just going to use index, and we're going to need that index anyways to take care of this error here. So let's go ahead and take care of that error. To do that, we're going to go to our to-dos map, and we're going to add a parameter. Make sure to add the parentheses, and then we're going to add a parameter called index. This is provided by the map function. This is a ES6 function, remember. So now we can go ahead and provide what's called a key, and that key is just going to be the index. That'll get rid of that error that we had before. So now if we add multiple items, we see we don't have the error. We'll take care of this one in a future video. So now that we have that taken care of, we're going to want to pass this function down as props to our to-do list item so we can call it in the onClick handler of the delete to do button. Now, one thing you'll have to look at is in React, there's multiple ways to pass functions through components. You can do it in a syntax like this. You can also do it in syntax like this, as well as this. Now, supposedly the best way to do it is here where you're defining it in this sort of manner and you're binding it to the class. So let's start with that. We'll go to our to-do list component, and we're going to have to switch the state to be inside of a constructor. So let's create a constructor, constructor, and we're going to want to go ahead and call super here. Now, instead of just state, we're going to have to call this.state. If you ever see props in the parameters of the constructor and the super, the only time you need to do that is if you're using props within the constructor. Since we're not doing that, we don't really need to do that, but we still do need to call super. Now, to bind that function to our class, as you can see here, all we have to do is call this dot the function name is equal to this dot the function name dot bind. So we can do this dot delete to do by index, and I'm just going to copy that. It's going to equal that dot bind this. So it's the same syntax no matter the function. You just change this to a different name. And now in our to-do list item here, we're going to go ahead and pass that as props. So we'll just give it the same function name. You could change this to something different if you wanted, but then you just call this dot and then the name of the actual function. So delete to do by index. Now if we go down into our to-do list item component, to call this, we'll just run props dot delete the name of our function. So it'll be delete to do by index. Now we don't have the index passed anywhere in here, so we're gonna need to go ahead and pass another prop that's gonna be the index. So let's pass index. Let me go ahead and make this look a little bit nicer. So now you can read it. So now we have the index passed as a prop. So now we can go ahead and add this here as props.index. So here's the function we called. Here's the index we passed. Now let's just add a console.log to make sure everything's going as planned. Oops, sorry guys. We'll say index. Now we can see what's logged. Now let's go back to our application, add a couple to-dos. Notice that that actual error message is gone. And now if we click delete to do, we should expect to see the number of the item in our array, which we do, index 1, index 2, index 0. So we'll come back in the next section and we're going to implement the actual changing of the state. We're going to actually implement the delete to do functionality. Let's get started. So now we have our function. Let's go ahead and delete this log. We don't necessarily need that any longer. and we're going to go ahead and we're changing the state. So we're going to call this .setState. And now we're going to want to make use of our previous state because we want to know we want to know the array of to-dos, and we don't want to start from scratch. And remember, we want those parentheses around there so we know it's being returned. Let me clean this up so you have a little bit of a better idea of what's going on. Okay, so now we're returning an object as the state. And what do we want to return? Well, we want to edit the to-dos. Now recall, if we just add one thing to the set state here, it's not going to modify any of the rest of the state. If we wanted to also modify the list title, we'd have to include it here. So now, what are we going to want to set? Well, we want our to-dos to be everything that was in the previous state, except for the one item in the array that we clicked delete on. So to do that, we're going to make use of a function called slice, and we're going to make use of something called a spread operator. I encourage you to read more about these online, but I'll give you a brief overview. So what we're going to do is we're going to run, this is what a spread operator does. We do 1, 2, 3 dots, and we'll do prev state dot to-dos. Now if we were to leave this as is, this would just reset the to-dos to exactly what it was. It would take all the previous state dot to-dos and put them all in this array. So we'd end up with the same thing, but we don't necessarily want that. We want to use a function called slice, which is going to take everything from a starting index to an ending index. So the starting index is going to be 0, where the array starts, all the way up to the index that's clicked. So now that will give us all of the to-dos up to that index, but we also want to include the to-dos after that index. So we're going to call the same function, previous state dot to-dos dot slice, and we're going to start at index +1. And if we don't provide a second parameter, it'll go all the way to the end. We could just do prev state dot to-dos dot length, but we don't really need to do that. So now if we go ahead and clean this up a little bit so it's easier to read. So now if we go test it, test 1, test 2, oops, test 3, I guess, test. Now if we delete a to-do, you see it's actually working. That's awesome, and they're gone if we refresh the page. So now we got our delete to-do by index function working. Recall we did that by passing it as a prop to our to-do list item component. To do that, we had to bind the function to this class, and we did that with this line here. Anytime you pass a function as props, you're going to want to do that, or you can use arrow functions or one of the other methods described here, and I encourage you to read more and decide which looks best for you. And then after that, we went into our onClick handler and we called that function we passed as props and provided an index that was provided by our map function. We also use that index to define our keys to get rid of that error saying we need unique keys for all of our components. Okay guys, we only have a few things left in wrapping up the course, and those are lifecycle methods, routing, and exporting our production assets. So component did mount is an example of a lifecycle method, and we'll go ahead and show you how you can apply that lifecycle method to give you an idea of how they work. Then I'll also provide a file giving you good ideas of where to go after this course to understand more aspects of the web development process, such as backends, databases, authentication, things of that sort. So let's get started with the lifecycle. So there's 3 stages to a component's lifecycle, and those are mounting, unmounting, and updating. Kind of said those out of order, but mounting is when, remember the concept we talked about with the virtual DOM at the beginning of this course. Mounting is taking those elements and adding them to the actual DOM of the client's browser. Updating is in response to a props or state update, causing the component to re-render. And then unmounting is removing that component from the DOM. So say you change pages or something of that nature. Within those stages, there's a few different lifecycle methods. There's more than are shown here, as you can see in the second diagram, but these are the main ones you'll use. Component did mount is used for fetching data from APIs or websites. Component did update is not called a lot, but a decent amount. So say you wanted to automatically upload a file as soon as a user adds it to the page, you could do that within this lifecycle method. And then component unmount. Here's some of the other lifecycle methods, but we're not going to go into detail on those in this course because you don't use them as often. In this section, we're going to learn how to use the component did mount lifecycle method. We'll use a third-party library called Axios to make a REST API request to this URL here to fetch some information about a to-do. Let's get started. We'll start out by running npm install Axios. A quick side tip, if you ever see Yarn, Yarn is just another package manager for Node, so you can also just run yarn add Axios. It's advised that you use only Yarn or npm for your projects, like one per project, because it'll create a yarn.lock or a package lock.json file, and so you only want one of those in your package. So let's implement Axios. We'll start by importing Axios from Axios, and then down here in component did mount, we can run axios.get, and we can put the URL in here. So let's just copy and paste this URL. And then this is a promise, so we need to run the .then and .catch. So if we get an error in our catch statement, we'll just log that error. And if we get a successful request, let's just start by logging that information as well. Okay, if we save that and we go back to our React application, we're gonna have to go ahead and go back and start it. So npm run start. Now if we wait for the page to refresh in our console, we should see the to-do information. So if we expand this object here, we see in data.data, we have the information about a to-do. So we could add that to our state here, just calling this .setState and say to-dos data.data. Well, we're gonna have to actually create an object here. So let's do id data.data.id title as data.data.title, and then finally we'll have completed as data.data.completed. Now once we go back here, we see we have that first to do in our actual state, and we can delete that to do if we'd like. In this section, we're going to learn about one more third-party library that'll give us access to some easy to use components and methods to handle routing within React. This library is called React Router. It's not made by Facebook, but it's probably the most widely used package for routing in React. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to install it. To do that, just like Axios, we'll run either npm install or yarn add React Router. We're actually going to add React Router DOM. Make sure you include that DOM. And so that's going to give us access to a few components in here. So we need to go ahead and wrap our entire application in what's called a browser router. It's going to give our components access to the routing methods and keep a history of our routing. So we're going to import that from React Router DOM. Now we're going to want to wrap our app component in this browser router. To do that, we'll go ahead and just add a browser router here, and then just save that. Now we can go ahead, we can go to our app component, and we can add a few more, we can add links between pages. So to do that, we'll import a component called link. That'll be from the same React Router DOM package. So we'll import link from React Router DOM. Now you see this error here. That's because you're required to return one top level component. So say it could be a div that'll take care of the problem, or React has something called a fragment that won't add an additional DOM node to the browser, which is good. So let's go ahead and add names to the links. So let's say we have our to-do list page, and maybe we have just a profile page. So let's go ahead, we'll add a prop called to. So let's say 2 to-dos. And then here let's do 2 equals profile. And we're gonna wanna go ahead and add a navigation component. So let's add that. We can define that within the same file if we want. So let's go ahead and do that. and we'll make this an arrow function. So we can just go ahead, if you want to include some logic in an arrow function, you can also just add brackets and then return what you wish to return. So let's return, say, let's make it a, let's move our links into that navigation actually. That's what we want to do. And now if we look at our component, we should have a couple links showing. Oh, we need to start our server. npm run start. And now it should show our navigation component, which contains our 2 links here in between the pages. So it's changing the route up there if you notice, but it's not changing the component. So to do that, we're going to want to add a router, or we're going to want to add routes. So let's go ahead. Routes are easily defined like that. We'll define a path, say /todos, and that will give us, and we need to return a component or provide a component as props, and that component will be, say, to-do list. Now we want to get rid of this one down here, or else it's going to render twice. And now if we're on the, oh, we need to import route, of course. And now see on profile, nothing's showing, but on to-do list, we can see our to-do list. So we need to add another route for /profile for our profile. So now if we click the profile button, we need to add, well, we have it tied to our to-do list component. So let's go ahead and just add another component and just call it profile. We can add that in the same page as well. So let's say const profile equals, and we'll return just a div saying profile. So now if we change this here, we can see, hey, if we're on profile, we're there or here. Now, once you do more complex routing, you're often going to want to wrap this in a switch component, which will only match the front of the first part of the URL. So say you have /todos /an ID, you can have different pages based on like the subroutes. So we're going to have to import the switch as well. But if you notice now, it's not going to change anything in our application. That's React Router, the basics at least.